Hey guys, tonight we begin with the surprisingly complicated world of pirate wives in the 1700s, because apparently even the most notorious sea criminals had to deal with in-laws and honey-do lists. Most people think being married to a pirate meant constant adventure and treasure chests full of gold, but the reality involved a lot more waiting around in port towns, wondering if your husband was dead, drunk, or just really bad at writing letters. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start with the biggest misconception about pirate wives. Most people imagine them as fierce, cutlass-wielding women who sailed alongside their husbands, braiding each other's beards and splitting treasure maps over romantic candlelit dinners. In reality, the vast majority of pirate wives were landbound women dealing with the maritime equivalent of having a husband who works offshore. Oil rigs, except the oil rig occasionally got attacked by other oil rigs, and sometimes your husband came home with a parrot and a suspicious number of golden earrings he claimed he found. Think of it like being married to a traveling salesman. If traveling salesmen regularly engaged in armed robbery and had a concerning tendency to lose limbs. This wasn't some swashbuckling romance novel. It was more like an extremely stressful long-distance relationship with a man whose job description included professional criminal and whose life insurance policy was, shall we say, non-existent. The early 1700s was what historians call the Golden Age of Piracy, which sounds much more glamorous than it actually was. The Caribbean wasn't some tropical paradise with cocktail umbrellas and steel drum bands. It was a humid, disease-ridden collection of islands where yellow fever competed with dysentery for the title of most creative way to ruin your vacation. Colonial governments controlled trade routes with the iron fist of bureaucracy, and the consequences of that control meant that if you wanted to make a living from the sea without filling out 17 different forms in triplicate, piracy started, looking like a viable career option. If you thought the 1700s were all powdered wigs and refined colonial society, think again. This was an era when dentistry was still considered witchcraft, bathing was viewed with suspicion, and the most advanced form of communication was hoping your letter didn't get eaten by whatever was living in the ship's hold. Port towns like Port Royal, Nassau, and Charleston were essentially the Wild West, but with more tropical diseases and worse dental care. Women in these communities had to be tough, not because they were warriors, but because surviving daily life required the kind of resilience usually reserved for Navy SEALs or people who work in customer service. The legal system was about as reliable as a chocolate teapot, which meant that when your pirate husband inevitably got arrested, you couldn't exactly call a lawyer. Instead, you had to rely on bribes, connections, or the hope that the governor was having a particularly good day and might commute a death sentence to something more manageable, like public flogging or exile to whatever passed for Siberia and the Caribbean. Meet Mary Ormond, who married the infamous Blackbeard. And yes, that's exactly as complicated as it sounds. Mary was a young widow from Bath, North Carolina, which in the 1700s was basically the equivalent of living in a quaint small town where everyone knows your business, except some of your neighbors are wanted by the British Navy. But here's the twist. Blackbeard, whose real name was Edward Teach, was actually trying to go legitimate when he married Mary. He'd accepted a royal pardon and was supposedly reformed, living the quiet life of a retired pirate, which is like saying a retired tornado is now working in weather forecasting. The wedding was quite the social event, assuming your idea of a social event involves a groom who collected wives, like some people collect stamps, and guests who were split between reformed pirates trying to blend into polite society and colonial officials, who weren't entirely convinced this whole retirement thing was going to stick. Mary, for her part, seemed to genuinely believe she was marrying a man who'd left his pirating days behind him, which shows either remarkable optimism or a stunning lack of understanding about how career changes work when your previous job involved terrorizing merchant vessels. The consequences were predictably messy. Within months of the wedding, Blackbeard was back to his old ways, and Mary found herself in the awkward position of being married to a man who was simultaneously the most wanted criminal in the Atlantic and someone who still expected her to have dinner ready when he got home from work. And if you think that's complicated, wait until you hear about the other 13 wives he may or may not have married in various ports. Apparently, Blackbeard's approach to marriage was quantity over quality. This wasn't just about one woman's unfortunate choice in husbands. The reality of being a pirate's wife affected entire communities and created a shadow economy of women who had to navigate between legitimate society and the criminal underworld. These women were often left to manage businesses, raise children, and maintain some semblance of respectability while their husbands were off committing acts of piracy that could get the whole family hanged if the authorities decided to get creative with their interpretation of guilt by association. Who was affected? Wives, certainly, but also their children, their extended families, their neighbors, and anyone unlucky enough to be related to someone who might have once shared a drink with a pirate. Why did this matter then and now? Because it reveals how ordinary people adapted to extraordinary circumstances, and how women in particular found ways to survive and thrive in situations that would challenge even the most resourceful individuals. The complexity and contradictions we'll explore show how real life rarely fits into the neat categories we create. These women were neither victims nor villains, but something more interesting and human than either stereotype. But Mary Ormond and her complicated marriage to Blackbeard was just the beginning. The daily reality of pirate wives involved everything from managing money that may or may not have been stolen to explaining to the neighbors why there were suspicious men with eye patches asking about your husband's whereabouts. The first major theme we need to explore is what daily life actually looked like for pirate wives. And spoiler alert, it wasn't all treasure maps and romantic sword fights. Unlike the Hollywood version where pirate wives spend their days in flowing gowns dramatically gazing out to sea, the reality was more like running a small business while your business partner was off, doing things that could get you both executed, and you had no idea when or if he was coming back. The historical context for this specific aspect is crucial to understand. In the early 1700s, women had about as many legal rights as a particularly well-regarded houseplant. They couldn't own property in their own names, couldn't vote, and couldn't even get divorced without an act of parliament, which was about as likely as getting a unicorn to do your taxes. So when your husband decided to pursue a career in maritime theft, you were basically along for the ride whether you liked it or not. Why did this domestic situation develop the way it did? Well, piracy was often a boom or bust profession. One successful raid could set a family up for months, while a string of failures could leave them eating hardtack and wondering if maybe they should have encouraged their husband to pursue something more stable, like subsistence farming or professional bear wrestling. The wives had to create stability in fundamentally unstable circumstances, which required the kind of creative problem-solving skills that would make modern MBA programs weep with envy. These women became masters of uncertainty management before that was even a business term. They had to budget money that arrived in irregular, often massive chunks. Imagine trying to manage household finances when your husband's paycheck might be 3 gold doubloons one month and a hold full of silk. and spices the next, assuming he wasn't currently chained to an oar in some Spanish prison ship. They developed what we might call today entrepreneurial resilience, except their startup was staying alive while married to someone whose business model was fundamentally illegal. Take the case of Anne Bonny's mother-in-law, whose name history has unfortunately lost, but whose story survives in the margins of court records. When Anne married James Bonny, a small-time pirate and professional disappointment, her mother-in-law found herself responsible for managing the family's legitimate business interests while Anne was off gallivanting around the Caribbean with Calico Jack Rackham. This poor woman had to run a tavern in Nassau, which was essentially like operating a bar in the Wild West, but with more tropical diseases and customers who paid in stolen goods. One documented incident involved a patron who attempted to settle his tab with what he claimed was a genuine Spanish silver chalice, which turned out to be a pewter mug with some silver paint slapped on it. The mother-in-law had to develop instant expertise in appraising potentially stolen religious artifacts, currency exchange rates for various colonial currencies, and the delicate art of refusing payment from armed men without getting stabbed. She allegedly kept a loaded pistol behind the bar and a rosary in her apron pocket, covering all her bases, as it were. Another fascinating example comes from the wife of Captain Charles Vane, one of the more successful pirates of the era, Elizabeth Vane. And yes, that was actually her name, which must have made introductions at social gatherings interesting. Had to manage not just household affairs, but also what amounted to a small-scale money laundering operation. When Charles would return from a successful raid, Elizabeth couldn't exactly deposit chests of Spanish gold at the local bank. Instead, she had to gradually convert stolen goods into legitimate currency through a network of fences, corrupt merchants, and officials who weren't too picky about paperwork. The process involved everything from melting down stolen silver to remove identifying marks, to trading exotic goods like Chinese silk for more mundane items like flour and livestock. Elizabeth essentially became a one-woman criminal enterprise. But instead of flashy heists, her crimes involved things like falsifying receipts and bribing customs officials. She had to keep detailed mental records of every transaction because writing anything down would have been evidence that could get her hanged. One particularly memorable case involved Elizabeth trying to trade a stolen Spanish religious statue for a milk cow. The farmer was suspicious because the statue was obviously valuable, and Elizabeth was obviously not Spanish nobility. But he was also practical enough to realize that asking too many questions might lead to uncomfortable answers. The negotiation reportedly took 3 hours and involved Elizabeth inventing an elaborate story about inheriting the statue from a dying aunt who had married a Spanish merchant. Whether the farmer believed her or simply decided that a possibly stolen religious artifact was worth a cow is lost to history, but Elizabeth got her milk cow, and the farmer got what he probably suspected was stolen goods. Everyone went home happy, if not entirely legal. The human interest angle here is that these women weren't criminals by choice. They were adapting to circumstances that would challenge anyone's moral flexibility. Elizabeth Vane didn't wake up one morning and decide to become a fence for stolen goods. She simply found herself married to a pirate and had to figure out how to turn their irregular income into food, shelter, and the occasional new dress. The broader implications of these stories show how ordinary people can find themselves participating in criminal enterprises simply by trying to survive in extraordinary circumstances. But it wasn't that simple, and if you've been paying attention so far, you probably saw that coming. The complicating factors were numerous and often contradictory. For one thing, many of these women were trying to maintain respectability in communities that knew exactly what their husbands did for a living. It was the 1700s equivalent of being married to someone in the mob. Everyone knows, but nobody talks about it directly. and somehow you're all expected to pretend this is normal. The contradictory evidence comes from the fact that many pirate wives were also deeply religious. Church records from Nassau and Port Royal show that women married to known pirates were regular attendees at services, contributed to church funds, and participated in community charitable activities. This created the surreal situation where the same woman who spent her weekdays converting stolen silver into grocery money would spend her Sundays praying for forgiveness and dropping coins into the collection plate. Different perspectives on these women's situations reveal even more complexity. Colonial authorities viewed them as criminal accomplices who should be prosecuted alongside their husbands. The church saw them as souls in need of salvation who were trapped by circumstances beyond their control. Their neighbors saw them as both dangerous associates of criminals and valuable members of the community who contributed to local economic activity. The women themselves seemed to view their situation as a job that required certain skills. They were neither proud nor ashamed, just practical. Why was the situation more complex than it appears? Because the line between legitimate business and piracy was often blurrier than we might expect. Many pirates held legal privateering commissions from various governments, which meant they were technically legal pirates, at least when attacking ships from countries their sponsors were at war with. A pirate wife might genuinely believe her husband was serving his country, right up until he decided to attack a ship from a country they weren't supposed to be fighting. A modern analogy might be being married to someone who works in a legal gray area. Imagine if your spouse worked for a company that you gradually realized was engaged in increasingly questionable business practices. Do you leave? Do you stay and try to influence them toward more legitimate work? Do you just keep your head down and hope the authorities don't come knocking? These women faced these exact dilemmas, but in an era when divorce was nearly impossible and economic, independence for women was practically non-existent. The result was a fascinating subculture of women who developed their own informal networks and support systems. These women affected not just their immediate families, but entire port communities. When Captain Kidd's wife Sarah was left to manage their property in New York after his execution, she had to navigate not just grief and financial hardship, but also the social stigma of being associated with one of the most notorious pirates in history. How people responded varied wildly depending on their relationship to the pirate families. Merchants who had profited from pirate gold suddenly developed convenient amnesia about their business relationships. Church leaders found themselves in the awkward position of providing spiritual guidance to women whose ties might have been funded by highway robbery on the high seas. Colonial governors had to balance the political pressure to crack down on piracy with the economic reality that pirate money was often a significant part of their colonies. Economies, institutional reactions were equally complicated. The British Navy wanted to arrest anyone associated with pirates, but colonial administrators often protected pirate families because they were valuable members of their communities. Courts struggled with the question of how much wives knew about their husbands, illegal activities, and whether ignorance was a valid defense when your husband came home with a ship full of obviously stolen goods. Long-term implications of this complicated social dynamic created lasting changes in how colonial societies viewed women's roles and responsibilities. The practical skills these women developed, financial management, negotiation, risk assessment, and crisis management, became valuable assets that helped shape early American business culture. Many of the most successful merchants and traders in the post-piracy era were women who had learned these skills while managing the complex logistics of being married to criminals. The social networks these women created also had lasting impacts. They developed informal communication systems that could spread news faster than official channels, created support networks for widows and orphans, and established business relationships that outlasted their husbands' criminal careers. Some historians argue that these networks became the foundation for later women's organizations and social movements in colonial America. Connect to ongoing narrative. These practical adaptations and social innovations didn't happen in isolation. They were part of a larger pattern of women finding ways to survive and thrive in circumstances that society never intended them to handle alone. Meanwhile, while these women were mastering the art of domestic money laundering and community reputation management, the legal and social frameworks around piracy were becoming increasingly complex. The connection to our previous discussion about daily life management becomes clear when we consider that these women weren't just managing households. They were essentially running small criminal enterprises while trying to maintain the appearance of respectability. What's particularly fascinating is how these domestic arrangements intersected with the larger political and economic forces at play in the Caribbean. As we'll see in our next section, the same women who were converting stolen silver into milk cows were also navigating international politics, colonial rivalries, and the complex web of relationships between pirates, merchants, and government officials. The skills they developed in managing their unusual domestic situations would prove crucial when they had to deal with even more complicated challenges involving legal systems, international trade, and the gradually changing nature of piracy itself. The buildup of anticipation for our next section lies in understanding how these personal domestic strategies played out on a larger scale, because managing a pirate husband's career involved much more than just budgeting a regular income and explaining away suspicious house guests. If the daily domestic management of pirate wives was like running a small business with a criminally unreliable business partner, then navigating the legal and social complexities of colonial society was like playing three-dimensional chess while blindfolded and riding a horse. The context for this new aspect involves understanding that these women existed in a legal gray area that would make modern lawyers break out in hives. They weren't technically criminals themselves, but they weren't exactly innocent bystanders either. Why this became important and relevant is fascinating from a historical perspective. Colonial legal systems in the 1700s were already complicated enough without adding piracy into the mix. You had English common law, various colonial statutes, maritime law, international treaties, and local customs all competing for jurisdiction, often in the same courtroom on the same day. When you threw pirate wives into this legal soup, the result was a jurisprudential nightmare that somehow had to be resolved by judges, who were often barely literate and frequently drunk. The social complexity was even more entertaining. Colonial society was rigidly hierarchical in theory, but chaotically practical in reality. A pirate's wife might technically be a criminal associate, but if she was also the best seamstress in town, the governor's wife's best friend, and a major contributor to the church building fund, suddenly her legal status became much more flexible. Social standing could trump legal technicalities, especially in small communities where everyone needed everyone else to survive. What made this particularly complicated was that many colonial officials were themselves involved in piracy, either directly or through business relationships that were so tangled they made modern corporate structures look simple. A governor might issue warrants for a pirate's arrest on Monday, have dinner with the pirate's wife on Tuesday, and accept a generous donation to his favorite charity from her on Wednesday, all while maintaining the fiction that he was upholding law and order. This created a social environment where everyone was playing multiple roles simultaneously, and the rules changed depending on who was watching and what they needed from each other. Consider the remarkable case of Rachel Wall, who holds the dubious honor of being the last woman hanged for piracy in Massachusetts, though her story illustrates perfectly how complicated these legal and social situations could become. Rachel started as a respectable fisherman's wife in Carlisle, which should had been a nice, quiet life involving mending nets and complaining about the weather. Instead, she married George Wall, who had the brilliant idea that they could make more money by pretending to be shipwreck victims and then robbing the Good Samaritans who came to help them. The scheme was ingenious in its simplicity and terrifying in its effectiveness. Rachel would stand on deck in a tattered dress, waving frantically for help, while George and his crew hid below. When merchant ships approached to offer assistance, the pirates would spring their trap. Rachel's role was crucial. She had to be convincing enough to lure victims, but also ruthless enough to participate in their robbery and occasional murder. The legal complexity arose because Rachel's defense team argued that she was merely following her husband's orders, which in the 1700s was actually considered a legitimate legal defense for married women. The background context makes this even more interesting. Rachel came from a respectable family and had been considered a model citizen before her marriage to George. Her transformation from fisherman's wife to pirate accomplice wasn't gradual. It happened almost overnight when George decided to change careers. The drama and conflict in their story wasn't just about piracy. It was about how quickly someone could fall from social respectability into criminal activity, and how the legal system struggled to deal with women who didn't fit traditional categories. What happened next reveals the arbitrary nature of colonial justice. After George died in a storm, which must have been either divine justice or spectacularly bad timing, Rachel returned to Boston and attempted to resume a normal life. She got a job as a domestic servant and seemed to be successfully reintegrating into legitimate society. The key players in her downfall were former victims who recognized her, but the resolution was complicated by the fact that some community members wanted to protect her while others demanded justice. The specific details that bring this story to life include Rachel's testimony, where she admitted to the piracy charges but denied murder charges, claiming she only robbed people and never actually killed anyone, as if there was some sort of criminal ethics scale where theft was acceptable. But murder crossed a line. The human elements of her story include her attempts to maintain dignity during her trial, a genuine seeming remorse for her crimes, and her insistence that she had been trying to live an honest life after her husband's death. The broader significance of Rachel's case is that it established legal precedents about women's culpability in their husbands' crimes and created social discussions about redemption, forgiveness, and the possibility of criminal rehabilitation. Her execution in 1789 was controversial not because people thought piracy was acceptable, but because many believed she had genuinely reformed and deserved a second chance. Another compelling example involves the wives of the pirates who worked with Captain Kidd. When Kidd was arrested and tried in London, the colonial authorities in New York had to figure out what to do with the wives and families he left behind. These women found themselves in the impossible position of being associated with one of the most notorious pirates in history while trying to maintain their standing in New York society. The most fascinating case was that of Sarah Kidd, the captain's wife, who managed to navigate the legal system with remarkable skill. She hired lawyers, petitioned colonial authorities, and even sent appeals to London, all while managing Kidd's business interests and trying to recover assets that had been seized by the government. Her story shows how some pirate wives became skilled legal advocates out of necessity, developing expertise in maritime law, property rights, and international treaties that would have impressed professional lawyers. The legal maneuvering involved in Sarah's case included arguments about whether property acquired through piracy could be legally inherited, whether wives could be held responsible for crimes committed by their husbands before marriage, and whether colonial courts had jurisdiction over crimes committed on the high seas. These weren't just technical legal questions. They were fundamental issues about how society would deal with the aftermath of the Golden Age of Piracy. This wasn't isolated to individual cases. A clear pattern emerges when you look at how colonial legal systems dealt with pirate wives across different jurisdictions and time periods. Other examples include the wives of pirates in the Carolinas, who developed sophisticated networks for influencing local officials, and the women in Jamaica who created informal legal advocacy groups that helped families navigate the complex process of recovering seized assets. The pattern explanation reveals something fascinating about early American legal development. These cases forced colonial courts to grapple with questions about women's legal status, criminal responsibility, and property rights that wouldn't be formally addressed in legal codes for decades. Pirate wives essentially became unwilling test cases for legal principles that would later influence American jurisprudence. Why this pattern existed relates to the fundamental contradiction between the theoretical legal system and practical colonial life. In theory, the law was clear and universal. In practice, it had to be flexible enough to deal with situations that the lawmakers in London had never imagined. Social, political, and economic factors all influenced how these cases were resolved, often in ways that had little to do with the actual legal statutes. The economic factors were particularly important because many colonial communities depended on pirate money, even if they didn't want to admit it. Prosecuting pirate wives too aggressively could disrupt local economies and alienate influential community members. Political factors included the complex relationships between colonial governors, London authorities, and local power structures. Everyone had different incentives and priorities that didn't always align. Comparison to other time periods reveals that this pattern of legal flexibility in dealing with criminal families wasn't unique to the piracy era. Similar issues arose during Prohibition, the Depression-era bank robbery epidemic, and even modern organized crime cases. The fundamental question remains the same. How do you deal with family members who benefit from criminal activity without necessarily participating directly in the crimes? The social factors were equally complex because these women often served important functions in their communities that had nothing to do with their husbands' criminal activities. They ran businesses, provided services, participated in charitable activities, and maintained social relationships that were valuable to their communities. Prosecuting them too harshly could disrupt social networks that everyone depended on, while ignoring their criminal associations could undermine the rule of law. This created a pattern where colonial authorities had to balance competing interests, maintaining law and order, preserving social stability, protecting economic relationships, and dealing with the practical reality that these women were often more valuable as community members than as criminal defendants. The effects were both immediate and long-lasting, creating ripple effects that influenced colonial society in ways that historians are still discovering. Who benefited from this complex legal and social navigation? Surprisingly, it wasn't just the pirate wives themselves. Colonial communities benefited from having experienced, resourceful women who had developed sophisticated skills in negotiation, crisis management, and network building. These women often became community leaders after their husbands' criminal careers ended, bringing valuable experience in dealing with complex legal and financial situations. Who suffered? Certainly the victims of piracy, but also the women themselves, who lived under constant stress and social uncertainty. Their children often faced discrimination and limited opportunities because of their fathers' reputations. The legal system itself suffered from the inconsistency and corruption that these cases revealed, undermining public confidence in colonial justice. The unintended consequences were perhaps the most interesting aspect of this situation. The legal precedents established in pirate wife cases inadvertently advanced women's legal rights in several areas. Because these women had to argue for their independence from their husband's criminal liability, courts were forced to recognize women's separate legal identities in ways that wouldn't become common for decades. Sarah Kidd's successful legal advocacy, for example, established precedents about married women's property rights that later lawyers would cite in completely different contexts. How this shaped future developments is visible in the evolution of American legal culture. The practical experience of colonial courts in dealing with these complex cases contributed to the development of more sophisticated legal reasoning about criminal responsibility, family liability, and the relationship between individual rights and social order. Many of the legal principles that emerged from pirate wife cases would later influence how American courts dealt with organized crime, white-collar crime, and family businesses involved in illegal activities. Modern parallels are surprisingly relevant. The same issues that colonial courts face with pirate wives appear in contemporary cases involving families of drug dealers, organized crime members, and white-collar criminals. The fundamental questions remain unchanged. How much should family members be held responsible for crimes they didn't directly commit? How do you balance individual rights with community safety? How do you deal with people who benefit from criminal activity without being criminals themselves? The lessons from these historical cases suggest that legal systems work best when they're flexible enough to deal with complex situations while maintaining consistent principles. The colonial approach of case-by-case evaluation, while sometimes leading to inconsistent results, allowed for more nuanced justice than rigid application of abstract legal rules might have provided. Yet even as these women were mastering the art of legal and social navigation, developing skills that would make modern crisis management consultants jealous, the larger world of piracy was reaching a dramatic crescendo that would test all their abilities to the breaking point. The next development we need to explore takes us from the relatively manageable challenges of daily domestic criminal enterprise management and local legal maneuvering to the high-stakes drama of what happened when the Golden Age of Piracy began to collapse. The transition to our next major element involves understanding that all the skills these women had developed, the financial management, the social networking, the legal advocacy, the crisis navigation, were about to be put to their ultimate test. Because when your husband's entire profession is being systematically destroyed by increasingly aggressive government crackdowns, and when the very communities that had previously provided protection and support are starting to turn against pirate families, all those carefully developed survival strategies suddenly have to work on a much larger and more dangerous scale. By 1718, the situation for pirate families had reached a breaking point that would make modern reality TV producers weep with envy at the drama potential. The description of tensions and problems reads like a perfect storm of bad timing, political pressure, and what historians politely call changing economic priorities, which is academic speak for piracy stopped being profitable enough to ignore the moral implications. The key players involved in this crisis included some of the most colorful characters in colonial history. On one side, you had Governor Woodes Rogers of the Bahamas, a former privateer turned pirate hunter who approached his new job with the enthusiasm of a reformed smoker lecturing people about lung cancer. On the other side were the pirate families, who had built entire communities around the assumption that their lifestyle was sustainable, which, in hindsight, was like building a retirement plan based on winning the lottery. Every month, the stakes involved were nothing less than the complete restructuring of Caribbean society. The British government had finally decided that piracy was more trouble than it was worth, which was a significant policy shift considering they had been essentially running a protection racket for privateers for over a century. The economic calculation was brutal but simple. Legitimate trade was becoming more profitable than semi-legal piracy, and the insurance costs for merchant shipping were getting ridiculous. What made this particularly dramatic was the speed of the change. communities that had operated under one set of rules for decades suddenly found themselves facing a completely different legal and social reality. It was like living in a town where gambling was legal, and then overnight finding out that not only was gambling now illegal, but anyone who had ever placed a bet was subject to prosecution, and their families might lose everything they owned. The psychological impact on pirate wives was enormous. These women had spent years developing survival strategies based on a certain set of assumptions about how society worked, what was tolerated, and what was punished. Suddenly, all those assumptions were invalid, and they had to completely rebuild. Their approach to everything from daily household management to long-term family planning. Imagine having to reinvent your entire life strategy while the authorities are actively hunting your husband and scrutinizing your every move for evidence of criminal activity. The most dramatic example of this crisis period was the Siege of Nassau in 1718, and when I say siege, I mean the most polite, bureaucratic siege in pirate history, because Governor Rogers understood that the best way to wage war and piracy wasn't through dramatic naval battles, but through the much more boring process of making legitimate life more attractive than criminal life. The build-up to this confrontation had been brewing for months. Rogers arrived in Nassau with a fleet, a royal pardon for any pirate willing to reform, and what amounted to the 18th century equivalent of a comprehensive social services program. The key moments leading up to the crisis involved Rogers, essentially, playing the world's most dangerous game of let's make a deal, offering pirates the choice between legitimate employment, exile, or hanging, which, from a negotiation standpoint, was remarkably straightforward. But here's where it gets interesting for our pirate wives. They suddenly found themselves in the position of having to convince their husbands to take a deal that would fundamentally change their entire way of life. Picture the domestic conversations. Honey, the governor is offering you a chance to become a legitimate merchant sailor with steady pay and legal employment. But what about the freedom, the adventure, the dramatically higher income potential? Well, the alternative is that he hangs you, so maybe we should consider the steady paycheck option. The play-by-play of important scenes during this period reads like a soap opera written by someone with a degree in maritime law. Take the case of Benjamin Hornigold, one of the most successful pirates in Nassau, whose wife had to navigate the delicate process of encouraging her husband to accept the royal pardon while simultaneously preparing for the possibility that he might reject it and force the family into exile or worse. Character motivations during this period were fascinatingly complex. The pirates themselves were torn between their pride in their criminal achievements and their growing awareness that the party was ending. Their wives had to balance their desire for safety and legitimacy against their loyalty to their husbands and their economic dependence on pirate income. The colonial authorities wanted to end piracy without creating martyrs or destabilizing the local economy. Unexpected developments included the fact that many pirates actually wanted to go legitimate, but didn't know how to do it without losing face with their crews. This created situations where pirate wives became unofficial diplomatic intermediaries, communicating between their husbands and colonial authorities, while maintaining plausible deniability for everyone involved. Some of the most important negotiations of this period took place in kitchens and parlors, with women serving as go-betweens for men who were too proud or too scared to negotiate directly. The climax came when Blackbeard himself, yes, the same Blackbeard who had married poor Mary Ormond, rejected Rogers' offer and essentially declared war on the new anti-piracy campaign. This wasn't just a personal decision. It was a statement that split the entire pirate community and forced every family to choose sides. The immediate aftermath involved a series of dramatic confrontations that would have made excellent television if anyone had invented television yet. One particularly memorable scene involved Charles Vane, another famous pirate, literally sailing past Roger's fleet while firing a defiant farewell salute, which was either an impressive display of courage or a spectacular example of poor judgment, depending on your perspective. Vane's wife Elizabeth, whom we met earlier, had to watch her husband essentially throw away their chance at legitimate happiness for the sake of his reputation, which must have been incredibly frustrating for a woman who had spent years managing the practical side of their criminal enterprise. The most dramatic moment came when Rogers posted notices throughout Nassau announcing that the amnesty period was ending and that any pirate who remained in the harbor after a certain date would be considered an enemy of the crown. Picture the scenes in pirate households as families had to make final decisions about their futures. Pack up and flee to remote hideouts, accept a pardon and try to build legitimate lives, or stay and fight a war they probably couldn't win. Dialogue from this period, preserved in various letters and court records, reveals the human drama behind these massive historical changes. Mary Ormond reportedly told a neighbor that she wished Edward had chosen a different profession, which might be the most understated way anyone has ever described being married to. Blackbeard. Elizabeth Vane's letters to her sister reveal her frustration with Charles's refusal to consider legitimate alternatives. He speaks of honor and freedom, but I think more of our children's future than of his pride. The immediate aftermath of Roger's ultimatum created chaos throughout the Caribbean pirate community. Families scattered in different directions, some accepting pardons, others fleeing to remote islands, and still others preparing for what they knew would be a final, probably fatal confrontation with colonial authorities. The women, as usual, had to manage the practical details of these life-changing decisions, while dealing with the emotional stress of watching their entire world collapse around them. The response was immediate, dramatic, and varied wildly depending on who you asked, and how much they had invested in the old system. Various parties' reactions revealed the complex web of relationships that had developed around pirate communities over the previous decades. The immediate consequences for pirate wives fell into several categories, none of them particularly pleasant. Those whose husbands accepted pardons found themselves trying to rebuild their lives in communities where everyone knew their history, but everyone was pretending to forget it. This created a social dynamic that was awkward at best and potentially dangerous at worst. Imagine trying to join the PTA when everyone knows your husband used to rob school buses, and you're all supposed to pretend that never happened. The political fallout was equally complex. Colonial governors who had previously tolerated or even encouraged piracy suddenly had to demonstrate their commitment to law and order, which meant prosecuting people they had formerly protected. This created legal complications that kept colonial courts busy for years and established precedents that would influence American jurisprudence well into the 19th century. Social fallout included the complete restructuring of port town economies. Communities that had thrived on pirate money had to find new sources of income, which often meant legitimate trade and manufacturing, a much more difficult and less profitable transition than anyone had anticipated. The women who had managed the informal economies around pirate communities found their skills in high demand as these communities tried to adapt to legitimate business practices. How this changed everything or nothing depends on your perspective. From the government's viewpoint, the crackdown was a spectacular success that established British control over Caribbean trade routes and demonstrated the effectiveness of combining amnesty offers with serious enforcement threats. From the pirates' perspective, it was the end of an era of freedom and independence that would never return. The ironic outcomes were numerous and often unexpected. Many former pirates who accepted pardons became successful legitimate merchants, using the same skills in navigation, negotiation, and risk assessment that had made them successful criminals. Some pirate wives discovered that their experience in managing complex financial and social networks made them valuable assets in legitimate business enterprises. Perhaps most ironically, the crackdown on piracy led to increased respect for women's business abilities in colonial society. The demonstrated competence of pirate wives in managing complex enterprises during crisis situations challenged traditional assumptions about women's capabilities and contributed to gradual changes in how colonial society viewed women's roles. In business and family management, the long-term effects included the transformation of Caribbean society from a chaotic mix of legitimate and criminal enterprises to a more regulated, but also more prosperous colonial economy. The skills that pirate wives had developed in crisis management, network building, and financial planning became valuable assets in the emerging legitimate economy, and many of these women became influential figures in their community's transition to respectability. This crisis period wasn't just about the end of individual pirate careers or even the collapse of pirate communities. It represented a fundamental shift in how colonial society balanced freedom and order, individual opportunity, and social stability. The deeper meaning of this transformation reveals how quickly social norms can change when economic and political incentives shift, and how ordinary people adapt to extraordinary changes in their circumstances. What the crackdown revealed about the system in society was both encouraging and disturbing. On the positive side, it showed that colonial communities were capable of remarkable flexibility and that people could successfully transition from criminal to legitimate lifestyles when given proper incentives and support. The success of many former pirates in legitimate businesses demonstrated that the skills required for successful piracy, risk assessment, leadership, navigation, and negotiation, were easily transferable to legal enterprises. On the disturbing side, the ease with which colonial society had previously accommodated piracy revealed the fundamental weakness of colonial legal and moral systems. The fact that piracy had been tolerated for so long, and that so many colonial officials had been complicit in pirate activities, raised serious questions about the rule of law and the integrity of colonial governance. Long-term effects of this crisis period influenced colonial American society in ways that extended far beyond the immediate piracy issue. The precedents established during the crackdown period influenced how later American governments would deal with organized crime, frontier lawlessness, and the challenge of integrating criminal populations into legitimate society. The experience also contributed to American legal traditions around amnesty, rehabilitation, and the balance between individual rights and community safety. Why historians still debate this period relates to fundamental questions about social change, individual agency, and the role of government in shaping behavior. Some historians view the piracy crackdown as a model of effective law enforcement that combined appropriate incentives with serious consequences. Others see it as an example of government overreach that destroyed vibrant, independent communities and forced people into restrictive social structures that limited their freedom and opportunities. The debate also reflects broader questions about how we evaluate historical figures who operated outside legal systems. Were pirates criminals who deserved punishment, or were they entrepreneurs who found creative solutions to limited economic opportunities? Were their wives innocent victims, criminal accomplices, or independent actors who made rational choices in difficult circumstances? These questions remain relevant because they reflect ongoing debates about crime, punishment, and social responsibility in modern society. Around the main events and themes we've explored, a fascinating cast of supporting characters played crucial roles in the lives of pirate wives, creating a social ecosystem that was part criminal enterprise, part small-town community, and part survival network. These weren't just background figures. They were the people who made the entire pirate wife lifestyle possible, profitable, and occasionally survivable. Margaret Brasiliano was perhaps the most successful fence in all of Port Royal. which was like being the most successful recycling coordinator in a city where everything being recycled was stolen. Margaret wasn't married to a pirate herself, but she was the person pirate wives turned to when they needed to convert a chest full of Spanish silver into something more practical, like food, clothing, or bribes for colonial officials. Her story reveals the sophisticated support networks that developed around pirate communities, and her significance to the broader narrative is that she shows how entire legitimate businesses could be built around servicing the needs of criminal families. Margaret's approach to business was impressively professional for someone operating in what was essentially a gray market economy. She maintained detailed records and code, naturally, of all her transactions, established credit relationships with pirate families, and even offered what amounted to financial planning services. When Captain Henry Morgan's wife needed to quietly liquidate some questionable jewelry before a colonial audit, Margaret arranged the transaction so smoothly that the official paperwork made it look like a perfectly legitimate estate sale. Her contribution to the narrative demonstrates how criminal enterprises require the same kind of professional support services as legitimate businesses, just with more creative bookkeeping. Reverend Samuel Jones represented a completely different aspect of pirate wife support networks. As the pastor of Nassau's main church, Jones found himself in the unusual position of providing spiritual guidance to women whose tithes were funded by highway robbery on the high seas. Rather than judging his parishioners, Jones developed what theologians would probably call practical Christianity. He focused on helping people navigate moral complexity rather than demanding moral purity. His different angle on the pirate wife experience was that he saw these women as souls in need of guidance, rather than criminals in need of punishment. Jones's contribution to our understanding of pirate communities is that he documented the genuine religious faith of many pirate families. His sermon notes, preserved in Nassau church records, reveal that pirate wives often struggled with the moral implications of their situations and sought spiritual counsel about how to live ethically while financially dependent on criminal activity. One particularly fascinating case involved a pirate wife who asked Jones whether she could donate stolen money to charity as a form of restitution, a question that probably wasn't covered in his seminary training. Perhaps the most colorful supporting character was Dr. Elizabeth Murray, one of the few female physicians in the Caribbean who found herself serving as the unofficial medical provider for pirate families. Dr. Murray's story shows another angle of how professional women navigated the complex social dynamics of pirate communities. She treated everyone regardless of their legal status, but she also developed expertise in treating injuries that legitimate doctors rarely encountered, like sword wounds, gunshot injuries, and the various tropical diseases that pirates picked up during their travels. Dr. Murray's significance goes beyond her medical practice. She became a trusted confidant for many pirate wives because she was one of the few people in their social circle who was both respectable and discreet. Her patient records, carefully coded to protect her clients' privacy, revealed the physical and emotional toll that the pirate lifestyle took on families. She treated everything from stress-related illnesses in wives worried about their husbands' safety to domestic violence injuries that occurred when pirates brought their work problems home. The most fascinating aspect of Dr. Murray's story is how she balanced her professional ethics with the practical realities of serving a criminal population. She developed innovative treatments for injuries that couldn't be reported to authorities, created herbal remedies for ailments that legitimate medicine couldn't address, and even provided what amounted to primitive psychological counseling for women dealing with the unique stresses of pirate family life. Her approach to medicine was holistic in a way that wouldn't become mainstream for another 2 centuries. These weren't isolated incidents. The stories of supporting characters like Margaret, Reverend Jones, and Dr. Murray were intricately connected through webs of relationships that made pirate communities function as surprisingly cohesive social units. How stories connect reveals a level of organization and mutual support that challenges our assumptions about criminal societies being chaotic or purely exploitative. The webs of relationships were complex and often surprising. Margaret Brasiliano's fencing operation, for example, wasn't just about buying and selling stolen goods. She also served as an informal banking system for pirate families, extending credit during lean periods and helping wives manage irregular income. Her relationship with Reverend Jones involved more than just attending church services. Jones often helped Margaret evaluate the moral implications of specific transactions, and Margaret provided financial support for Jones's charitable activities. This created a situation where a fence and a minister were essentially business partners in community development. Political and social networks around pirate communities were equally intricate. Dr. Murray's medical practice connected her to colonial officials who needed discreet medical care, pirate families who required specialized treatment, and legitimate merchants who appreciated having a doctor who didn't ask uncomfortable questions about unusual injuries. These connections meant that Dr. Murray often served as an informal intelligence network, passing information between different groups while maintaining professional confidentiality. How one event led to another is perhaps best illustrated through the interconnected crisis that occurred when Captain Calico Jack Rackham was captured in 1720. This single event created ripple effects throughout the entire support network around pirate families. Margaret Brasiliano suddenly found herself with inventory she couldn't move because potential buyers were worried about increased government scrutiny. Reverend Jones had to provide spiritual counsel to Anne Bonny's friends and family while navigating the political pressure to denounce piracy from his pulpit. Dr. Murray found herself treating stress-related illnesses throughout the community as families worried about their own vulnerability. The unintended consequences and connections reveal how deeply integrated these support networks had become with legitimate colonial society. When the pirate community was disrupted, it affected everyone from tavern owners who lost customers to merchants, who lost suppliers to church organizations that lost financial supporters. The colonial government discovered that cracking down on piracy meant disrupting social services, economic relationships, and community structures that served both criminal and legitimate populations. One particularly fascinating example of these interconnections involves the case of a pirate wife named Catherine Brass, whose husband was captured during the same period as Calico Jack. Catherine turned to Margaret Brasiliano for financial support, Reverend Jones for spiritual guidance, and Dr. Murray for medical care during her pregnancy. But the connections didn't stop there. Margaret had business relationships with Catherine's neighbors. Jones had performed marriages and baptisms for Catherine's extended family, and Dr. Murray had delivered babies for several women in Catherine's social circle. When Catherine's husband was executed, the response involved the entire network. Margaret helped Catherine liquidate her assets and provided financial advice about managing as a single mother. Jones conducted the memorial service and helped Catherine navigate the social stigma of being a pirate's widow. Dr. Murray provided ongoing medical care for Catherine and her child, and eventually helped Catherine find employment as a midwife. Assistant. The broader implications of these interconnected stories show how criminal and legitimate communities can become so deeply intertwined that it becomes impossible to separate them cleanly. The support networks that developed around pirate families weren't just criminal enterprises. They were community institutions that provided services and support that legitimate colonial society often failed to provide. This integration meant that ending piracy required rebuilding entire social and economic systems, not just arresting individual criminals. These interconnected relationships also reveal how women created informal power structures that operated alongside, and sometimes in opposition to formal colonial hierarchies. The network of relationships between pirate wives, female business owners like Margaret, female professionals like Dr. Murray, and female religious figures created a parallel social system that gave women more agency and influence than they typically had in colonial society. To understand the world of pirate wives and their supporting networks, you have to understand the cultural elements that made their lifestyle possible and, in many ways, necessary. Daily life in Caribbean port towns during the early 1700s was fundamentally different from what most people imagine when they think about colonial America. These weren't quaint New England villages with white picket fences and community church suppers. They were rough, multicultural frontier towns where survival required adaptability, pragmatism, and a healthy disregard for conventional social norms. Beliefs and attitudes in these communities were shaped by the constant presence of death, disease, and economic uncertainty. Religion was important, but it was practical religion focused on survival and community support rather than abstract theology. People believed in divine providence, but they also believed in helping providence along through careful planning, strategic alliances, and what we might politely call flexible ethics. The moral framework that governed these communities was based more on loyalty, reciprocity, and mutual aid than on abstract principles of right and wrong. Social structures in pirate communities were surprisingly egalitarian compared to other colonial societies. The presence of criminal activity created a leveling effect where traditional hierarchies based on birth, education, or legitimate wealth were less important than practical skills, personal relationships, and the ability to contribute to community survival. Women in pirate communities often had more social and economic freedom than their counterparts in more conventional colonial settings because the communities needed everyone's skills and couldn't afford to waste talent based on gender restrictions. What was normal versus exceptional in these communities would have seemed completely backwards to people from more conventional colonial societies. It was normal for women to manage complex financial transactions involving questionable goods, to maintain social relationships with people of different races and nationalities, and to make independent decisions about family and business matters. It was exceptional for anyone to ask too many questions about the source of someone's income or to expect people to conform to conventional moral standards. How this cultural context shaped events is visible throughout the stories we've explored. The success of support networks like Margaret Brasiliano's fencing operation depended on community acceptance of moral ambiguity and financial creativity. Reverend Jones's practical approach to Christianity worked because his congregation understood that survival sometimes required compromise. Dr. Murray's medical practice thrived because the community valued practical results over professional orthodoxy. The cultural flexibility of these communities also explains why the transition away from piracy was so difficult for many families. It wasn't just about giving up criminal income. It was about adapting to social structures and moral frameworks that were fundamentally different from what they had experienced in pirate communities. The skills and attitudes that made people successful in pirate communities didn't always translate well to more conventional colonial society. Perhaps most fascinating was the fundamental contradiction at the heart of pirate communities. They were criminal societies that often functioned more ethically and efficiently than legitimate colonial institutions. The ironic situation emerges when you realize that pirate communities, despite being based on theft and violence, often provided better social services, more economic opportunity, and greater personal freedom than the legitimate colonial societies they were supposedly threatening. Examples of these contradictions abound in the historical record. pirate communities were more racially integrated than legitimate colonial societies. But they achieved this integration through criminal activity rather than enlightened social policy. Women in pirate communities had more economic and social freedom than women in conventional colonial society, but this freedom came at the cost of social respectability and legal security. The informal support networks that developed around pirate families were more comprehensive and effective than official colonial social services, but they were funded through criminal activity and couldn't be sustained once piracy was suppressed. How things weren't what they seemed is perhaps best illustrated through the example of Nassau during its pirate heyday. From the outside, Nassau appeared to be a lawless den of criminals and outcasts. From the inside, it was a functioning community with its own social structures, economic systems, and moral codes. The pirates who terrorized merchant ships often treated their own community members with remarkable generosity and loyalty. The women who benefited from stolen wealth often used that wealth to support charitable activities and community development. Modern parallels to these contradictions can be found in contemporary situations where illegal or underground economies provide services and opportunities that legitimate institutions fail to provide. The same moral complexity that pirate wives faced in the 1700s appears in modern cases involving people who benefit from illegal activities while contributing positively to their communities. The fundamental question remains the same. How do we evaluate people in communities that achieve positive social outcomes through questionable means? The contradictions in pirate communities reveal the complexity of human societies and the limitations of simple moral categories. These weren't just criminal organizations or legitimate communities. They were something more complicated and interesting than either label captures. Everything changed when the British government finally realized that running a colonial empire, while simultaneously tolerating large-scale piracy, was like trying to operate a bank while allowing customers to rob the vault on weekends. Eventually, someone in accounting was going to notice the discrepancy. The turning point event wasn't a single dramatic moment, but rather a series of policy decisions that fundamentally altered the economic and political landscape of the Caribbean, creating what historians call the end of the Golden Age of Piracy, which sounds much more poetic than the period when crime stopped being profitable enough to ignore. The background to this change involves understanding that the British Empire had reached a level of administrative sophistication where they could actually calculate the cost of piracy versus the benefits of legitimate trade. The key factors that led to transformation include the development of more efficient naval technology, the establishment of more effective colonial governance, and the simple fact that insurance costs for merchant shipping had reached levels that made everyone involved question whether this whole tolerate piracy for political convenience strategy was really working out. Why this moment was different from previous attempts to suppress piracy relates to the convergence of multiple factors that hadn't previously aligned. Earlier anti-piracy efforts had failed because colonial governors were often corrupt, naval forces were inadequate, and the economic incentives favored tolerance of piracy over suppression. By the late 1710s, however, the British had developed both the administrative capacity and the political will to address piracy systematically rather than sporadically. The economic calculation that drove this change was remarkably straightforward once someone bothered to do the math. Legitimate trade was becoming more profitable than semi-legitimate piracy, especially when you factored in the costs of naval protection, insurance, diplomatic complications, and the general chaos that piracy created in colonial administration. The British discovered that having stable, predictable trade routes was worth more than having deniable assets who could harass Spanish shipping. Political factors also played a crucial role in this transformation. The War of Spanish Succession had ended in 1714, which meant that the British no longer needed privateers to attack Spanish shipping under the cover of legitimate warfare. Suddenly, all those pirates who had been useful military assets became inconvenient criminals who were causing diplomatic problems with other European powers. The technological and administrative changes that made this transformation possible included improvements in naval ship design, better communication systems between colonies and London, and the development of more sophisticated legal and bureaucratic tools for colonial governance. The British Empire was becoming more professional and less improvisational, which meant that policies had to be based on long-term strategic thinking rather than short-term tactical convenience. For pirate wives, this shift represented a fundamental change in the rules of the game they had been playing for decades. The skills they had developed, the networks they had built, and the strategies they had perfected were all based on assumptions about how colonial society worked, and suddenly, those assumptions were becoming invalid. How change unfolded was a fascinating example of how large-scale social transformation actually happens, not through dramatic revolutionary moments, but through a series of bureaucratic decisions, economic pressures, and individual choices that collectively created an entirely new social reality. The process was like watching a slow-motion avalanche, where each small shift made the next change more inevitable until the entire landscape had been transformed. Resistance to change came from predictable sources, but took unexpected forms. Pirates themselves obviously opposed the new anti-piracy policies, but their resistance wasn't just military. It was also economic and social. Pirate communities had become integrated into colonial economies in ways that made sudden suppression economically disruptive for everyone involved. Legitimate merchants who had profited from pirate money, colonial officials who had accepted pirate bribes, and service providers who had built businesses around pirate communities all had reasons to resist change. The wives found themselves in particularly complicated positions during this resistance phase. Many of them had developed genuine attachments to their communities and didn't want to abandon the social networks they had spent years building. Others were pragmatic enough to recognize that change was inevitable and focused on positioning themselves and their families to survive the transition. Still others tried to have it both ways, maintaining their pirate connections while developing backup plans in case the legitimate option became necessary. Champions of change included not just government officials, but also some unexpected allies within pirate communities themselves. Some pirates had grown tired of the constant uncertainty and violence of their lifestyle and were ready to try something different. More importantly, some pirate wives became active advocates for change because they recognized that the current situation was unsustainable and dangerous for their families. The specific steps and stages of this transformation reveal how complex social change actually works. The first stage involved the establishment of clear government policies and the deployment of adequate military force to enforce them. The second stage involved creating economic incentives for pirates to abandon their criminal careers voluntarily. The third stage involved providing social and legal mechanisms for former pirates to integrate into legitimate colonial society. Obstacles encountered during this process were numerous and often unexpected. One major problem was that many colonial officials had been complicit in piracy for so long that they lacked credibility as advocates for legitimate governance. Another issue was that the skills that made people successful pirates, risk-taking, independence, disregard for authority, didn't necessarily translate well to success in legitimate colonial society, which valued conformity, stability, and respect for hierarchy. Breakthrough moments in this process often involved individual success stories that demonstrated the viability of legitimate alternatives to piracy. When former pirates like Benjamin Hornigold successfully transitioned to careers as pirate hunters, it showed other pirate families that change was possible. When pirate wives like Sarah Kidd successfully navigated the legal system to protect their family's interests, it demonstrated that women could play active roles in managing the transition. The role of individuals versus larger forces in this transformation is particularly interesting when viewed through the lens of pirate wives' experiences. While the broad economic and political forces driving change were beyond any individual's control, the specific ways that families and communities adapted to those forces depended heavily on individual choices, skills, and relationships. Women played crucial roles in this transformation process because they often had stronger connections to legitimate colonial society than their husbands did. Many pirate wives maintained relationships with family members, church communities, and business networks that weren't directly involved in piracy. These connections became valuable assets during the transition period because they provided pathways back into a legitimate society. The adaptation strategies that pirate wives developed during this period were remarkably sophisticated. Some focused on gradual economic transition, slowly converting pirate assets into legitimate investments. Others emphasized social rehabilitation, working to rebuild their reputations in their communities. Still others pursued geographic solutions, moving to new locations where their past associations wouldn't be as well known. Perhaps most importantly, many pirate wives became advocates for change within their own families and communities. They used their influence with their husbands to encourage acceptance of amnesty offers and legitimate employment opportunities. They worked with other women to develop support networks for families, making the transition from criminal to legitimate lifestyles. They served as informal mediators between pirate communities and colonial authorities, helping to negotiate solutions that benefited everyone involved. The success of this transformation process depended heavily on the willingness of pirate wives to embrace change and their ability to manage the complex logistics of family and community transition. Without their active participation and support, the end of the Golden Age of Piracy would have been much more violent and disruptive than it actually was. The new system that emerged from this transformation was fundamentally different from what had existed before, creating a colonial society that was more regulated, more predictable, and arguably more prosperous, but also less exciting and less tolerant of individual entrepreneurship. The description of this new reality reveals both the benefits and the costs of the transition from piracy-tolerant to piracy-free colonial society. How things were different was immediately apparent to anyone who had lived through the transition. Port towns that had previously buzzed with the chaotic energy of pirate communities became more orderly, but also more boring. The colorful mix of nationalities, races, and social classes that had characterized places like Nassau gave way to more conventional colonial hierarchies based on legitimate wealth, proper education, and appropriate social connections. Who won and who lost in this transformation is more complicated than it might initially appear. Colonial governments obviously won because they gained control over trade routes and eliminated the diplomatic complications that piracy had created. Legitimate merchants won because they could now operate without the constant threat of piracy and the high insurance costs that piracy had imposed. The British Empire won because it could now extract wealth from its colonies more efficiently and predictably. But the winner's circle also included some unexpected beneficiaries. Many former pirate wives discovered that their skills in crisis management, financial planning, and network building made them valuable assets in the legitimate colonial economy. Some women who had managed complex criminal enterprises found that running legitimate businesses was actually easier because they didn't have to worry about legal complications or violent competitors. The losers included not just pirates themselves, but also the entire informal economy that had developed around pirate communities. Small business owners who had provided services to pirate families, artisans who had crafted specialized goods for pirate customers, and service providers who had adapted their businesses to pirate needs all had to find new sources of income. New rules and norms that governed this transformed society were much more rigid than what had existed during the pirate era. Social hierarchies became more formal and less flexible. Economic opportunities became more limited, but also more secure. Legal protections became stronger, but also more restrictive. The new colonial society offered greater stability and security, but demanded greater conformity and social obedience in return. What stayed the same versus what changed dramatically reveals the complexity of this social transformation. The basic structure of colonial society, with governors, courts, churches, and merchant communities, remained essentially unchanged. But the informal networks, flexible social arrangements, and entrepreneurial opportunities that had characterized pirate communities largely disappeared. For pirate wives specifically, the new reality meant trading the excitement and uncertainty of their previous lifestyle for the security and predictability of conventional colonial life. Some thrived in this new environment, using their accumulated skills and resources to build successful, legitimate businesses or to achieve respected positions in their communities. Others struggled with the loss of the independence and flexibility they had enjoyed during the pirate era. The most significant change was perhaps the narrowing of options available to women. During the pirate era, women had been able to participate in a wide range of economic and social activities that weren't available in conventional colonial society. The new reality offered greater security, but fewer opportunities for the kind of independent, entrepreneurial lifestyle that many pirate wives had developed. Was this change positive or negative? The answer depends entirely on your perspective and what you value most in a society: stability or excitement, security or freedom, predictability or opportunity. Different perspectives on the transformation reveal the complexity of evaluating large-scale social change and the difficulty of making simple moral judgments about historical developments. From the government's viewpoint, the end of piracy was unquestionably positive. It established legitimate authority, created stable trade relationships, and eliminated the diplomatic complications that piracy had created with other European powers. Colonial administrators could finally govern their territories without having to balance legitimate policy goals against the need to accommodate criminal enterprises. From the perspective of legitimate merchants and law-abiding colonists, the transformation was also clearly beneficial. They could now engage in trade and commerce without the constant threat of piracy, the high costs of protection and insurance, and the moral complications of living in communities where criminal activity was tolerated or even celebrated. From the pirate family's perspective, the evaluation is much more complicated. Some genuinely welcomed the opportunity to live legitimate lives without the constant stress and danger that piracy involved. Others mourned the loss of the independence, excitement, and economic opportunity that the pirate lifestyle had provided. Many probably had mixed feelings, grateful for increased security, but nostalgic for the freedom they had lost. Short-term versus long-term effects present different evaluation frameworks. In the short term, the suppression of piracy was disruptive and economically painful for many communities that had depended on pirate money. In the long term, it contributed to the development of more stable and prosperous colonial societies that would eventually become the foundation for independent nations. Unintended consequences of the anti-piracy campaign included the loss of some positive aspects of pirate communities: their racial integration, their economic opportunities for women, and their relatively egalitarian social structures. The new legitimate colonial society was more stable, but also more stratified and less flexible. Modern judgment versus contemporary views reveals how our evaluation of historical events changes over time. Contemporary observers focused on the immediate benefits of increased security and legitimate governance. Modern historians are more likely to recognize both the benefits and the costs of this transformation, and to appreciate the complexity of the social changes involved in the years and decades that followed the Great Piracy Crackdown. The evolution of former pirate communities resembled nothing so much as a massive social experiment in criminal rehabilitation, except nobody had bothered to write an instruction manual, and the participants were making it up as they went along. How things developed reveals both the resilience of human communities and the unexpected ways that criminal skills can be repurposed for legitimate ends. The new challenges that emerged were often more complex than the original problems of managing a pirate lifestyle. Former pirate wives discovered that while converting stolen silver into grocery money had been stressful, navigating the social politics of legitimate colonial society was somehow even more exhausting. These women had to learn entirely new sets of social rules while pretending they had always known them, which was like trying to join a country club while hoping nobody notices. You learned etiquette from prison guards. Evolution of the situation took several fascinating directions that nobody had anticipated. Some former pirate communities transformed themselves into legitimate trading centers, using their knowledge of Caribbean geography and international commerce to become successful merchants. Others became centers of shipbuilding and maritime services, applying their technical expertise to legal enterprises. A few communities simply reinvented themselves completely, becoming farming settlements or manufacturing centers that bore no resemblance to their piratical origins. Second generation effects proved to be particularly interesting from a social development perspective. The children of former pirates often became some of the most successful and respected members of colonial society, perhaps because they inherited their parents' entrepreneurial skills without the criminal associations. These second-generation ex-pirate families often became leading citizens in their communities, which created interesting dynamics when their parents' histories were still living memory. The psychological aftermath for pirate wives was complex and varied. Some experienced what we might now recognize as post-traumatic stress from years of uncertainty and danger, while others thrived in their new stability and security. Many struggled with identity issues after years of defining themselves in relation to their unusual circumstances. They had to figure out who they were in conventional society. Financial aftermath was equally varied. Some families had managed to save and invest their pirate earnings wisely and found themselves quite comfortable in legitimate society. Others discovered that the skills that had kept them financially afloat during the pirate era, like converting stolen goods into usable currency, weren't easily transferable to legitimate economic activity. A few families lost everything during the transition and had to start over from scratch. The social aftermath involved a gradual process of community memory management. Former pirate communities had to collectively decide how much of their history to remember, how much to forget, and how much to creatively reinterpret. This process created community myths and legends that often bore only passing resemblance to historical reality, but served important social functions in helping people construct new identities for themselves and their communities. The post-piracy era brought forward new important figures and institutions that hadn't existed during the Golden Age of Piracy, creating a completely different social and economic landscape for former pirate families to navigate. These new elements represented both opportunities and challenges for women who had spent years mastering one set of survival skills and now had to learn entirely different ones. Colonial administrators who arrived in the post-piracy period were a fundamentally different breed from their predecessors. Unlike the previous generation of governors, who had often been military men comfortable with moral ambiguity, the new administrators were trained bureaucrats who valued efficiency, predictability, and proper paperwork above all else. Their roles in the new social order emphasize regulatory compliance and systematic governance rather than the flexible, personal relationships that had characterized earlier colonial administration. How they differed from earlier players was immediately apparent to anyone who had lived through the transition. Where previous governors might negotiate informal arrangements with pirate families, the new administrators insisted on following proper legal procedures for everything. This created both opportunities and obstacles for former pirate wives. Opportunities because the new system was more predictable and fair. Obstacles because it was also more rigid and less forgiving of irregular circumstances. The emergence of legitimate merchant families as major social and economic forces created new power structures that former pirate families had to navigate carefully. These merchant dynasties often had long memories about which families had prospered through piracy, and they weren't always welcoming to former criminal families trying to join legitimate society. Some merchant families became allies and business partners with reformed pirate families, while others remained permanently suspicious of anyone with a questionable past. Religious institutions also evolved significantly during this period, with new churches and religious organizations that had different approaches to moral questions than the pragmatic Christianity that had characterized pirate-era religious life. These new religious leaders often emphasized moral purity and social conformity in ways that created challenges for former pirate families, who were still working through the ethical complications of their past lives. Their contributions and disruptions to the evolving social order were significant and often unexpected. The new administrators brought efficiency and predictability to colonial governance, but they also brought inflexibility and bureaucratic complexity that sometimes made simple problems much more difficult to solve. The merchant families created economic opportunities and social stability, but they also established social hierarchies that were less fluid and forgiving than what had existed during the pirate era. Specific stories about these new elements reveal how social change actually works at the community level. One particularly fascinating example involves the arrival of a new colonial judge who was determined to apply legal standards consistently, regardless of people's past associations or current social standing. This created both opportunities for former pirate families to prove their respectability and risks that their past activities might be subjected to renewed legal scrutiny. The new merchant families often served as informal gatekeepers for social acceptance, determining which former pirate families would be welcomed into legitimate society and which would remain permanently marked by their criminal associations. Some merchant families were remarkably forgiving and practical, focusing on current behavior rather than past activities. Others were less charitable and used their social influence to exclude former pirate families from business opportunities and social events. These new players fundamentally changed the rules of social and economic advancement in former pirate communities, creating both new opportunities and new obstacles for families trying to build legitimate lives after piracy. But some problems persisted long after the dramatic transformation of Caribbean society, proving that changing laws and social structures doesn't automatically solve all the underlying issues that made piracy attractive in the first place. The continuing challenges faced by former pirate families reveal how deeply social problems can be embedded in economic and cultural systems. What didn't get resolved was often more significant than what did. The fundamental economic inequality that had made piracy attractive to many people remained largely unchanged in post-piracy colonial society. Legitimate economic opportunities were still limited, social mobility was still restricted, and the gap between rich and poor was still substantial. Former pirates who had turned to crime because they couldn't find adequate legitimate employment often discovered that the legitimate job market hadn't improved much during their criminal careers. New versions of old problems emerged as colonial. Society became more regulated and stratified. Where piracy had once provided economic opportunities for people outside traditional social hierarchies, the new legitimate society offered fewer alternatives for people who didn't fit conventional categories. This was particularly challenging for women who had developed independent economic roles during the pirate era but found that legitimate society expected them to conform to more traditional gender roles. Cyclical patterns began to emerge as some of the children and grandchildren of former pirates found themselves facing similar economic and social pressures that had driven their ancestors to crime. While these later generations typically didn't turn to piracy, which was no longer a viable option, they sometimes became involved in other forms of illegal or semi-legal activity, from smuggling to fraud to various forms of tax evasion. Why? Certain issues proved intractable relates to the fundamental structure of colonial society and economy. The social and economic systems that replaced piracy were more stable and predictable, but they were also more rigid and less accommodating to people who didn't fit standard patterns. Former pirate families often found themselves caught between their irregular past and a present that demanded conformity to social norms they had never fully internalized. The most persistent ongoing issue was probably the question of social acceptance and community integration. Even families that successfully transitioned to legitimate lifestyles often found that their pirate associations continued to affect their social standing for generations. This created a kind of permanent social penalty that was particularly difficult for women, who often bore the brunt of community judgment about their family's moral respectability. Economic integration also remained challenging for many former pirate families. While some succeeded in converting their criminal assets into legitimate wealth, others found that their irregular income history made it difficult to establish credit, build business relationships, or gain acceptance into legitimate commercial networks. The skills that had made them successful in criminal enterprises didn't always translate effectively to legitimate business success. Legal issues also persisted, as colonial legal systems struggled to deal with the complex legacy of the piracy era. Questions about property rights, inheritance laws, and criminal liability continued to surface in colonial courts for decades after piracy had been suppressed. Former pirate families often found themselves dealing with legal complications related to their past activities long after they had established legitimate lifestyles. The psychological and social integration challenges were perhaps the most difficult to resolve because they involved fundamental questions about identity, community belonging, and social acceptance that couldn't be addressed through policy changes or legal reforms alone. Compared to other periods of major social transformation and to similar situations in different geographic locations, the post-piracy transition in the Caribbean reveals both universal patterns of social change and unique features that were specific to the colonial maritime context. What was unique about this particular transformation provides insights into how criminal communities adapt to changing social and economic circumstances. What was unique to the Caribbean piracy transition was the speed and completeness of the change. Unlike other forms of organized crime that evolved gradually or moved to different locations, Caribbean piracy was essentially eliminated as a viable lifestyle within a single generation. This rapid transformation created unique challenges for families who had to completely reinvent themselves in a relatively short time period. The geographic isolation of Caribbean communities also created unique dynamics. Unlike criminal families in continental settings who could relocate to different regions, Caribbean pirate families were often trapped in small communities where everyone knew their history. This meant that social reinvention had to happen in place under the watchful eyes of neighbors who remembered their criminal past. What was universal about this transformation relates to broader Patterns of how criminal communities respond to changing enforcement and economic conditions. The strategies that pirate wives developed for managing family transitions mirror those used by families involved in other types of organized crime throughout history. The emphasis on education for children, the gradual conversion of criminal assets into legitimate investments, and the careful management of social relationships are patterns that appear in many different contexts. Lessons that could be learned from the Caribbean experience include the importance of providing legitimate economic alternatives when suppressing criminal activity, the value of amnesty programs that allow for genuine rehabilitation, and the need to address the social and economic conditions that make crime attractive in the first place. The relative success of the anti-piracy campaign suggests that criminal activity can be effectively suppressed when enforcement is combined with genuine opportunities for legitimate advancement. Patterns that repeated elsewhere include the tendency for former criminal families to become some of the most law-abiding members of society, often overcompensating for their past by becoming extremely committed to legitimate values and institutions. This pattern appears in many different historical contexts and suggests something important about human adaptability and the possibility of genuine social rehabilitation. The Caribbean piracy transition also demonstrates how quickly social norms can change when economic and political incentives shift. Communities that had tolerated and even celebrated criminal activity for decades were able to transition to legitimate lifestyles remarkably quickly when the incentive structure changed. This suggests that social change is often more possible than it appears, and that communities have greater capacity for adaptation than we might expect. The most important comparative insight is probably that successful transitions from criminal to legitimate lifestyles require both individual effort and community support, along with genuine economic opportunities and social acceptance taught by the 1730s and 1740s. Signs pointed to the complete end of the pirate wife era as a distinct social phenomenon, marking the final transformation of Caribbean society from a chaotic mix of criminal and legitimate enterprises to something resembling conventional colonial civilization. The warning signs were everywhere for anyone paying attention, though like most major historical changes, they were probably more obvious in hindsight than they were to people living through them at the time. What key players could see versus what they missed reveals the fundamental challenge of recognizing historical turning points while you're experiencing them. Colonial administrators could clearly see that piracy was no longer a significant threat to maritime commerce, but they probably didn't fully understand that they were witnessing the end of an entire social system that had shaped Caribbean culture for generations. Former pirate wives could see that their communities were becoming more conventional and respectable, but they might not have realized they were among the last generation of women to have lived through such an extraordinary historical experience. The most obvious warning sign was generational change. The children and grandchildren of former pirates were growing up in legitimate colonial society with no direct experience of the piracy era. These younger generations often had little interest in preserving the memory or culture of their parents' and grandparents' criminal past. They wanted to be accepted as respectable colonial citizens, which meant distancing themselves from family histories that might compromise their social standing. Economic signs of change were equally clear to anyone looking for them. The complex financial networks that had once been necessary for managing pirate income were no longer needed. The fencing operations, the informal banking systems, and the creative accounting methods that had characterized pirate family financial management were being replaced by conventional colonial banking and legitimate business practices. Social signs included the gradual disappearance of the diverse, multicultural communities that had characterized pirate settlements. As these communities became more respectable, they also became more homogeneous and conventional. the racial integration, gender flexibility, and social mobility that had distinguished pirate communities from other colonial settlements were gradually replaced by more traditional colonial social hierarchies. Resistance to inevitable change took various forms, from nostalgia for the excitement of the pirate era to attempts to preserve family traditions and community memories. Some former pirate wives tried to maintain the informal networks and mutual support systems that had developed during the criminal era, but these efforts became increasingly difficult as communities became more conventional and regulated. Perhaps the most poignant sign of change was the way that stories about the pirate era began to change. What had once been lived experience became family legend, and family legend gradually transformed into romantic myth. The harsh realities of pirate life, the violence, the uncertainty, the moral complexity were gradually replaced by romanticized narratives that emphasized adventure and freedom while downplaying the criminal aspects of piracy. The resistance to change often came from unexpected sources, including some colonial officials who had found the flexibility and informality of the pirate era easier to manage than the bureaucratic complexity of fully legitimate colonial governance. How the era of pirate wives ended wasn't through any single dramatic event, but rather through the gradual process of social evolution that made their unique lifestyle irrelevant and unnecessary. The end came not with a bang, but with a whimper, or more accurately, with the sound of children asking their grandmothers to please stop telling embarrassing stories about the family's colorful past because it was affecting their prospects for advantageous marriages. The specific events that marked the transition were often mundane but symbolically significant. The last of the old-style taverns that had served as informal community centers for pirate families were either closed or transformed into respectable inns. The informal markets where pirate wives had once sold questionably obtained goods became regulated marketplaces subject to colonial taxation and oversight. The creative financial arrangements that had allowed pirate families to manage irregular income were replaced by conventional banking relationships. Final major players in this transition included the last generation of women who had actually lived as pirate wives during the Golden Age of Piracy. By the 1740s, these women were elderly, and their deaths marked the end of direct personal experience with the pirate lifestyle. Their children and grandchildren might preserve family stories and traditions, but they had no first-hand knowledge of what it had actually been like to manage a household while your husband was off committing acts of piracy. Last attempts to preserve the pirate way of life were usually unsuccessful and often tragic. A few die-hard pirates continued operating in remote areas of the Caribbean, but they were essentially anachronisms, criminals operating without the community support, economic networks, or political tolerance that had made piracy viable during its golden age. Their wives faced the impossible challenge of trying to maintain a lifestyle that no longer had any social or economic foundation. The dramatic final moments of the pirate wife era often involved individual women making the difficult decision to completely reinvent themselves and their families' identities. This might mean moving to new communities where their past wasn't known, changing their names, or creating entirely fictional family histories that eliminated any reference to pirate associations. These personal transformations were often more dramatic than any of the military conflicts that had ended the careers of their husbands. Gradual decline was perhaps more common than dramatic endings. Many pirate wives simply found that their communities had evolved around them to the point where their past experiences and skills were no longer relevant or valuable. They might continue living in the same places, but the social and economic context had changed so completely that they were essentially strangers in their own communities. The symbolic endpoints of this era are visible in colonial records that show the last legal cases involving pirate-era property disputes. the last church records mentioning the need for special pastoral care for former pirate families, and the last colonial administrative documents dealing with the social integration of former criminal communities. These bureaucratic markers indicate when colonial society stopped treating former pirate families as a special category requiring particular attention or accommodation. One particularly poignant example of this ending involves the estate records of Sarah Kidd, Captain Kidd's widow, who died in 1744 after spending more than 4 decades trying to recover property seized when her husband was executed. Her death marked not just the end of one woman's long legal struggle, but also the end of an era when pirate wives were significant enough figures in colonial society to warrant sustained legal and political attention. The transformation was also marked by changes in how communities remembered their pirate past. Where once these stories had been told as recent history with practical lessons for current challenges, they gradually became entertainment, tales of adventure and romance that bore little resemblance to the complex social and economic realities that pirate families had actually experienced. This shift from memory to mythology marked the final transformation of pirate wives from real people dealing with real challenges to romantic figures in colonial folklore. Analysis of the causes behind the end of the pirate wife era reveals a complex interaction of internal problems, external pressures, and broader historical forces that made this unique social phenomenon ultimately unsustainable. The role of individuals versus historical forces in this ending demonstrates how personal choices and larger social trends can reinforce each other to create irreversible change. Internal problems within pirate communities had been accumulating for decades and eventually reached a critical mass that made the lifestyle unsustainable. The most significant internal issue was probably the generational divide between older pirate families and their children, who increasingly wanted to participate in legitimate colonial society rather than maintain their parents' criminal associations. This created family tensions that often forced parents to choose between preserving their pirate lifestyle and maintaining relationships with their children. Economic internal problems included the gradual erosion of the financial networks that had made pirate family management possible. As the legitimate colonial economy became more sophisticated and regulated, the informal systems that pirate wives had developed for managing irregular income became both unnecessary and suspicious. Women who had once been financial innovators found themselves using increasingly outdated methods in a world that was moving towards standardized banking and accounting practices. External pressures included not just government enforcement, but also changing social expectations about what constituted respectable behavior in colonial society. The same communities that had once tolerated or even celebrated pirate families began to view them as embarrassing reminders of a more chaotic and less civilized past. This social pressure was often more effective than legal enforcement in encouraging families to abandon their pirate associations. The role of individuals in this ending was significant because the transition often depended on personal decisions by key figures within pirate communities. When influential pirate wives chose to embrace legitimate lifestyles and encourage their families to do the same, it created momentum for broader community change. When respected former pirates successfully established legitimate businesses or achieved positions of responsibility in colonial society, it demonstrated the viability of alternatives to criminal lifestyle. Historical forces beyond individual control included the broader economic and political development of the British Empire, which was becoming more efficient at extracting wealth from its colonies through legitimate channels and less tolerant of the disruption and uncertainty that piracy created. The empire was also developing more sophisticated administrative and military capabilities that made suppressing piracy more feasible than it had been in earlier periods. What could have been done differently is an interesting counterfactual question that reveals the contingent nature of historical change. If colonial governments had been more accommodating to former pirate families, if legitimate economic opportunities had been more abundant, or if pirate communities had been more successful at adapting their social structures to changing circumstances, the pirate wife era might have lasted longer or evolved in different directions. Inevitability versus contingency in this historical ending suggests that while the broad trend toward more regulated and legitimate colonial society was probably inevitable, the specific timing and manner of the pirate wife era's end was influenced by particular individuals, events, and circumstances that could have developed differently. The ending was neither completely predetermined nor entirely accidental, but rather the result of a complex interaction between broad historical trends and specific historical circumstances. The most important factor in the ending was probably the simple fact that piracy stopped offering sufficient advantages over legitimate alternatives to justify the risks and complications involved. The immediate aftermath of the pirate wife era's end was characterized by a fascinating process of social amnesia and mythologization that transformed real historical experiences into romantic legends within a single generation. Who stepped into the vacuum left by the disappearance of pirate communities reveals how quickly social roles and institutions can be replaced when historical circumstances change. Short-term consequences of this ending were both predictable and surprising. The predictable consequences included the normalization of colonial society and the elimination of the social tensions that had existed between criminal and legitimate communities. Caribbean port towns became more conventional and orderly, but they also became less colorful and less economically dynamic than they had been during the pirate era. The surprising consequences included the discovery that many of the innovations developed by pirate communities, from financial management techniques to conflict resolution methods to social integration practices, had been valuable contributions to colonial society that were lost when pirate communities disappeared. Some colonial administrators found themselves missing the flexibility and pragmatism that had characterized pirate-era governance. Contemporary reactions to the end of the pirate wife era were mixed and often contradictory. Many colonial officials and respectable citizens expressed relief that this chaotic chapter of Caribbean history was finally over. But there was also nostalgia for the excitement and opportunity that the pirate era had represented, and concern about whether the new legitimate society would provide adequate opportunities for economic advancement and social mobility. The women who had been pirate wives often found themselves in the peculiar position of being living reminders of a period that their communities wanted to forget. Some adapted by completely reinventing themselves and their family histories. Others preserved their memories privately while maintaining respectable public personas. A few became unofficial community historians, preserving stories and traditions that might otherwise have been lost. Attempts at revival or continuation of pirate-era traditions were generally unsuccessful, but occasionally touched the broad social changes that were transforming colonial society. Some former pirate families tried to maintain the informal mutual support networks that had characterized pirate communities. But these efforts were gradually overwhelmed by the more formal social and economic institutions of legitimate colonial society. The immediate legacy also included the beginning of the romanticization process that would eventually transform pirate wives from complex historical figures into simplified romantic stereotypes. Even within their own lifetimes, some of these women found that popular stories about their experiences bore little resemblance to what they had actually lived through. Perhaps most importantly, the immediate aftermath included the loss of a unique form of women's economic and social independence that wouldn't be matched in most colonial communities for another century. The pirate wife era had created opportunities for women to develop skills and assume responsibilities that were uncommon in conventional colonial society. And the end of that era represented a significant step backward in women's practical autonomy and influence. The legacy of pirate wives shaped later developments in colonial American society in ways that historians are still discovering, creating ripple effects that influenced everything from women's legal rights to business practices to community organization methods. Their specific influences on subsequent historical developments were often indirect, but remarkably persistent, like the way a stone thrown into a pond creates waves that eventually reach shores you never intended to touch. How later generations viewed the pirate wife experience reveals the complex process by which societies transform lived experience into historical memory and then into cultural mythology. The immediate post-pirate generation, the children and grandchildren of pirate wives, often tried to forget or minimize their families' criminal associations while preserving the practical skills and social networks that their mothers and grandmothers had developed. This selective memory process created a sanitized version of pirate wife history that emphasized entrepreneurship and independence while downplaying the process. Created a sanitized version of pirate wife history that emphasized entrepreneurship and independence while downplaying the process. Created a selective memory process, created a sanitized version of pirate wife entrepreneurship and independence while downplaying the criminal context. By the Revolutionary War period, just a few decades later, the pirate wife experience had already been transformed into a symbol of colonial American independence and resistance to authority. Revolutionary propagandists found the pirate wife story useful for promoting ideas about self-reliance, resistance to unjust laws, and the rights of colonial communities to govern themselves according to their own needs, rather than distant imperial policies. This political appropriation of pirate wife history was both flattering and deeply ironic, since the real pirate wives had been primarily concerned with survival rather than political resistance. Myths versus realities that developed around pirate wives demonstrate how historical memory works to serve the needs of later generations rather than preserve accurate understanding of past experiences. The myth that emerged emphasized the romantic adventure of pirate life while eliminating the stress, uncertainty, and moral complexity that had actually characterized these women's experiences. Later colonial Americans wanted to remember pirate wives as brave, independent women who had chosen exciting lives, rather than as people who had been trapped by circumstances and forced to develop creative survival strategies. Why the pirate wife experience remained important to later generations relates to broader themes in American cultural development. These women represented values that became central to American identity: independence, resourcefulness, adaptability, and the ability to create community and prosperity under challenging circumstances. The fact that they had achieved these things while operating outside conventional legal and social structures made their stories even more appealing to later Americans who were themselves challenging British authority and creating new forms of social organization. The influence on legal and social development was perhaps more significant than the cultural influence. Many of the legal precedents established in cases involving pirate wives, particularly regarding women's property rights, criminal liability, and family responsibility, influenced the development of American law well into the 19th century. Colonial court struggles with questions about how much wives should be held responsible for their husbands' crimes, and how much independent legal identity married women should have, created precedents that later lawyers and judges would cite. In completely different contexts, the business and economic practices that pirate wives had developed also had lasting influences. Their innovations in financial management, risk assessment, network building and crisis management became part of the broader toolkit of colonial American business culture. Many of the most successful merchant families in later colonial and early American periods had learned these skills directly or indirectly from the pirate wife experience. Perhaps most importantly, the pirate wife legacy contributed to distinctly American ideas about women's capabilities and potential roles in society. While conventional colonial culture had viewed women as dependent and subordinate, the pirate wife experience had demonstrated that women could successfully manage complex enterprises, navigate legal systems, and provide community leadership under the most challenging circumstances. Today, we can see echoes of the pirate wife experience in a surprising number of modern situations, revealing how certain aspects of human nature and social organization remain constant even as technology and legal systems evolve. The specific parallels between 18th century pirate wives and contemporary situations demonstrate that the fundamental challenges these women faced, managing family life while associated with illegal activities, navigating complex legal and social systems, and building community networks under difficult circumstances, remain remarkably relevant. The most obvious modern parallel involves families connected to organized crime, where wives and family members face similar challenges in managing the tension between loyalty to family members and participation in illegal activities. Like pirate wives, these modern women often find themselves managing households with irregular income from questionable sources while trying to maintain some degree of social respectability and protect their children from the consequences of their family's criminal associations. Another striking parallel exists in the experiences of families connected to various forms of white-collar crime. The wives of executives involved in major financial frauds, tax evasion schemes, or corporate corruption face remarkably similar challenges to pirate wives. They must navigate complex legal systems while trying to preserve their families' financial security and social standing. Like their 18th century predecessors, these women often find themselves in the position of having benefited from criminal activity without necessarily having direct knowledge of or participation in the crimes themselves. Modern military families, particularly those involved in classified or controversial operations, face some similar challenges in managing family life. When the primary breadwinner's work involves activities that can't be discussed openly and may involve moral complexity. While these situations are usually legal, they create similar dynamics around secrecy, community integration, and family stress management that pirate wives would have recognized. The experiences of families in the modern gig economy also echo some aspects of pirate wife life, particularly the challenge of managing households with irregular, unpredictable income. While gig work is legal, it creates similar financial management challenges to those faced by pirate wives who had to budget for families when income might be feast or famine, depending on their husband's success in criminal enterprises. Immigration. Families, particularly those with undocumented members, face parallel challenges in navigating legal systems while trying to maintain family stability and community integration. The constant awareness of potential legal consequences, the need to maintain networks of mutual support, and the challenge of accessing legitimate services while avoiding official attention create dynamics that pirate wives would have understood. What hasn't changed about human nature is perhaps most visible in how families respond to crisis situations and legal uncertainty. The same strategies that pirate wives developed, building informal support networks, developing multiple income streams, maintaining flexibility in family roles, and creating backup plans for various contingencies, appear in modern families. Facing similar challenges, similar patterns in different contexts include the way communities respond to families associated with controversial or illegal activities. The same dynamics of selective social acceptance, informal economic networks, and gradual integration or exclusion that characterize colonial communities' relationships with pirate families appear in modern communities dealing with families connected to various forms of criminal activity. Modern technology has obviously changed the specifics of how these challenges are managed, but the fundamental human and social dynamics remain remarkably consistent. Modern families dealing with legal uncertainty still rely on informal networks, still struggle with questions about moral responsibility and family loyalty, and still face the challenge of balancing survival needs against social acceptance. Perhaps most significantly, the modern parallels reveal how the skills that pirate wives developed, crisis management, network building, financial creativity, and social navigation, remain valuable and relevant in contemporary situations. The specific historical context of Caribbean piracy is gone, but the human challenges these women faced and the solutions they developed continue to appear in new forms and contexts. The lesson from these modern parallels is that the pirate wife experience, while historically specific, illuminates universal aspects of how families and communities adapt to challenging circumstances and navigate the complex relationships between individual survival, family loyalty, and social responsibility. Even now, the pirate wife experience continues to influence modern areas of study and practice in ways that reveal the lasting relevance of their innovations and adaptations. Academic study of the pirate wife phenomenon has contributed to several important fields of historical and social research, particularly in areas related to women's history, criminal justice, and community development. The field of women's business history has been significantly influenced by research into how pirate wives managed complex financial and commercial operations under extremely challenging circumstances. Their innovations in risk management, network building, and crisis response have become case studies for understanding women's economic agency in historical contexts and for analyzing how women develop entrepreneurial skills under adverse conditions. Criminal justice research has drawn important insights from the pirate wife experience about family involvement in criminal enterprises, the challenges of transitioning from criminal to legitimate lifestyles, and the effectiveness of various approaches to criminal rehabilitation. The relatively successful transition of many pirate families to legitimate lifestyles provides valuable data for understanding how criminal rehabilitation can work when combined with genuine economic opportunities and community support. Popular culture continues to be influenced by romanticized versions of pirate wife stories, though these cultural representations often bear little resemblance to historical reality. The persistence of pirate wife characters in literature, films, and television demonstrates the continuing appeal of stories about women who achieved independence and agency under challenging circumstances, even if the specific historical context is usually misrepresented. Political discourse occasionally references the pirate wife experience as an example of early American independence and entrepreneurship, though these political appropriations usually ignore the criminal context and focus only on the aspects of the story that support contemporary political narratives. This selective use of historical example demonstrates how historical experiences can be transformed to serve modern ideological purposes. Social movements related to criminal justice reform, women's rights, and community development sometimes draw inspiration from the pirate wife experience as an example of how communities can develop innovative solutions to social problems when conventional institutions fail to meet their needs. The informal networks and mutual support systems that pirate wives created serve as models for modern community organizing efforts. Why people still care about the pirate wife experience relates to its embodiment of themes that remain relevant to contemporary concerns. The challenge of maintaining family stability under difficult circumstances, the possibility of successful rehabilitation and social reintegration, and the potential for women to achieve agency and influence even in restrictive social contexts. These themes continue to resonate because they address fundamental human concerns about survival, family, community, and social justice that transcend specific historical periods. Looking back across our exploration of what it was like to be a pirate's wife in the 1700s, we've seen a remarkable story of human adaptability, creativity, and resilience that challenges almost every assumption we might have had about both piracy and colonial women's lives. The major themes that emerge from our journey reveal how ordinary people can develop extraordinary skills when faced with circumstances that would challenge even the most resourceful individuals. Key patterns that we've discovered include the remarkable consistency with which these women developed similar survival strategies across different communities and time periods. Whether they were managing the domestic economy of a pirate household, navigating complex legal systems, or building support networks that could sustain families through crisis, pirate wives demonstrated a level of innovation and practical intelligence that would impress modern business consultants and crisis management experts. The most surprising discoveries probably involve how normal and even mundane much of pirate wife life actually was. Despite the romantic mythology that has grown up around piracy, the day-to-day reality for these women was remarkably similar to the challenges faced by any family dealing with irregular income, uncertain employment, and social marginalization. The difference was mainly a matter of degree. While other colonial wives might worry about their husband's success in legitimate but risky occupations like trading or farming, pirate wives had to worry about whether their husbands would come home with treasure, come home empty-handed, or not come home at all. Most important takeaways from our exploration include the recognition that these women were neither victims nor villains, but rather people who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances and developed creative solutions to unprecedented challenges. Their experiences illuminate universal aspects of human nature: the drive to protect family, the capacity to adapt to changing circumstances, and the ability to create community and meaning even under the most difficult conditions. How our understanding has evolved throughout this journey reflects the complexity of historical experience and the danger of accepting simple narratives about complex social phenomena. We began with the common misconception that pirate wives were either swashbuckling adventurers or helpless victims, and we've discovered instead that they were skilled managers, creative problem solvers, and community builders who operated in a world that required constant adaptation and innovation. The broader historical significance of the pirate wife experience extends far beyond its immediate context to illuminate fundamental questions about how societies balance individual freedom with collective security, how communities integrate marginal populations, and how social change actually happens at the human level. These women lived through one of the most dramatic social transformations in colonial American history, and their experiences provide invaluable insights into how ordinary people navigate extraordinary change. Perhaps most importantly, our journey has revealed how the skills and strategies that pirate wives developed, crisis management, network building, financial creativity, and social navigation, remain relevant and valuable in contemporary contexts, suggesting that their historical experience continues to offer practical insights for modern challenges. One final compelling anecdote that encapsulates the broader themes we've explored involves Elizabeth Bonny, not to be confused with the famous Anne Bonny, a woman whose name appears in Nassau church records from 1742 as having donated a substantial sum for the construction of a new orphanage. The church records note that Mrs. Bonny was a widow of respectable character whose generosity reflects her Christian commitment to the welfare of children in need. What makes this story remarkable is that Elizabeth Bonny was almost certainly the widow of a pirate, probably one of the many minor criminals who had operated in Caribbean waters during the 1710s and 1720s. By 1742, she had successfully transformed herself from the wife of a criminal into a pillar of her community, someone whose charitable activities were publicly celebrated, and whose reputation was solid enough that the church was comfortable acknowledging her contributions in their official records. This story encapsulates the broader themes of our exploration because it demonstrates the complete arc of the pirate wife experience, from criminal association to legitimate respectability, from social marginalization to community leadership, from survival-focused crisis management to charitable generosity. Elizabeth's transformation wasn't unique. Church and court records from throughout the former pirate regions contain similar stories of women who successfully navigated the transition from criminal families to respectable colonial citizens. What this story reveals about the women we've been discussing is that their experiences during the pirate era weren't just about survival. They were also about developing skills, networks, and perspectives that could be adapted to serve positive social purposes when circumstances changed. The same crisis management abilities that had helped Elizabeth manage an irregular household income during her husband's criminal career later enabled her to organize charitable activities and community projects. How Elizabeth's story connects to everything we've discussed is that it shows the ultimate possibility of transformation and redemption that existed within the pirate wife experience. These women weren't permanently marked by their association with criminal activity. They were people who could grow, change, and contribute positively to their communities when given the opportunity and support to do so. The memorable final image that Elizabeth's story provides is of a woman whose past had included the stress and uncertainty of being married to a pirate, but whose future included the satisfaction of contributing to her community's welfare and being recognized as a person of good character and generous spirit. This transformation wasn't automatic or easy. It required years of careful social navigation, financial management, and community relationship building. But it was possible. Elizabeth's charitable work with orphans is particularly symbolic because it suggests that her own experiences with uncertainty and marginalization had given her empathy for other vulnerable people in her community. The skills she had developed in creating support networks during the pirate era were perfectly suited to organizing charitable activities and community services. The peaceful conclusion that Elizabeth's story represents a former pirate wife, remembered not for her criminal associations, but for her contributions to community welfare, provides a fitting end to our exploration of these remarkable women. It reminds us that while the pirate wife era was full of drama and excitement, its ultimate significance lies in demonstrating human capacity for adaptation, growth, and positive contribution to community life. As we reach the end of our journey through the world of pirate wives in the 1700s, there's something deeply satisfying about discovering that these women's stories don't end with tragedy or dramatic confrontation, but rather with the quiet satisfaction of lives well lived and communities well served. Their experiences remind us that even the most extraordinary circumstances are ultimately about ordinary human concerns, protecting family, building community, and finding meaning in whatever situation life presents. The general conclusion we can draw from their stories is that human resilience and creativity are remarkable forces that can transform even the most challenging circumstances into opportunities for growth and contribution. These women face situations that would overwhelm most of us, and they not only survived but often thrived, leaving behind communities that were stronger and more caring because of their presence. In the end, the pirate wives of the 1700s offer us a reminder that every generation faces its own version of unprecedented challenges, and that ordinary people consistently prove capable of extraordinary adaptation and achievement. Their legacy isn't really about piracy at all. It's about the fundamental human capacity to create meaning, community, and positive change under any circumstances. There's something uniquely peaceful about reaching the end of a story that spans decades and touches on so many aspects of human experience. We've traveled together through the daily realities of managing criminal households, the complex social navigation required to survive in colonial society, the dramatic transformations that marked the end of the pirate era, and the quiet satisfactions of building legitimate lives from extraordinary beginnings. The appreciation we can feel for these women's experiences goes beyond simple admiration for their courage or cleverness. It extends to gratitude for the reminder they provide that human beings are capable of remarkable adaptation and that communities can be built and rebuilt even under the most challenging circumstances. The invitation to reflection that their stories provide is both personal and universal. On a personal level, their experiences challenge us to think about how we might respond to extraordinary circumstances and what skills we might need to develop to navigate uncertainty and change. On a universal level, their stories remind us that every community includes people who are dealing with challenges we might not fully understand, and that judgment should be tempered with recognition of the complexity of human experience. Perhaps, most importantly, their stories remind us that transformation and redemption are always possible, and that the skills we develop during difficult periods of our lives can ultimately serve positive purposes we never imagined. As we close our exploration of these remarkable women's lives, imagine for a moment the sunset over Port Royal or Nassau. In the 1750s, decades after the end of the Golden Age of Piracy, the harbors that had once been filled with pirate ships were now home to legitimate merchants and fishing boats. The taverns that had once hosted planning sessions for illegal raids were now ordinary inns, serving travelers and local families. And in the houses throughout these communities lived women who had once been pirate wives, now grandmothers, telling carefully edited stories to children who would grow up to be doctors, merchants, ministers, and community leaders. The excitement and danger of the pirate era had given way to the quieter satisfactions of legitimate life. But the skills these women had developed, the resilience, the creativity, the capacity for community building, lived on in their families and communities. In the end, that's perhaps the most fitting legacy, not the dramatic adventures of their youth, but the quiet strength they brought to building the foundations of the communities that would become part of the American story.